What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I'm going to be bringing you a video that I have put quite a lot of thought into, and which has taken quite a lot of preparation. If you didn't know, music is one of my passions. I would say my three main passions are filmmaking and animation, music, and writing. In a lot of my film and television reviews, you may have also noticed that I typically go in-depth about the score, and that's not something that a lot of other people typically talk about, and that's just because music is something that I am fascinated by. I used to be a singer, a part of a choir before this whole COVID-19 pandemic started and a lot of in-person interactions were cut off. I also play a variety of instruments, particularly guitar, and that's just because music is something that I love. So today I would like to share with you my top 10 favorite musical scores of all time. The reason I say musical scores and not film scores is because I'm going to be talking about scores from both film and television, so I feel it would not be fair to title this video as either one because I'm not talking about either one individually. Before I get into my top 10, however, I would like to give a few honorable mentions that I also really love but that just didn't quite make the top 10. In no particular order, here are my honorable mentions. First up, we have How to Train Your Dragon, a score that's just always tonally fitting within the story, whether it be epic, emotional, or just whimsically fun. It's easily the most memorable of John Powell's scores, in my opinion. Spider-Man 3 is easily the most memorable of the Sam Raimi film scores, in my opinion, which I think is a controversial opinion because a lot of people love Danny Elfman's work on the first two films, but I actually feel Christopher Young brought the most to the table in the third film. His theme for Sandman in particular is beautiful and perfectly complements the imagery on display in the Birth of Sandman scene, which is one of my favorite scenes in any comic book film. True Grit from 2010 is a fantastic score by Carter Burwell. His consistent repetition of the hymn leaning on the everlasting arms is beautiful and constantly brings out the emotions on every single rewatch. Indiana Jones is of course an iconic score, but it's one that just doesn't really resonate with me as much as a lot of other film scores. There's no denying the iconicness of the original theme, but aside from that, I can't really think of any themes or pieces from the Indiana Jones series that actually stick out in my mind. The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett scores as well are fantastic. Although Ludwig Göransson only composed the main theme for the Book of Boba Fett, and it was actually Joseph Shirley who did the rest of that score, a lot of music in the Book of Boba Fett does draw inspiration from Ludwig Göransson's themes for The Mandalorian, which are just so incredibly distinct and unique compared to other Star Wars soundtracks, and that I just find so fun to listen to on their own. With those out of the way, let's get into my top 10. Now, I'm not someone who typically likes to say that the newest thing is the best, but upon my recent viewing of the His Dark Materials series on HBO, Lorne Balfe's score instantly became one of my favorites. Every episode opens with this immaculate title sequence underscored perfectly by his main theme, which sets the tone very well for the rest of the series. In simply one episode, his score encompasses a variety of different emotions and tones. The first episode opens with Lyra and her friend Roger running through the hallways of Oxford University with this whimsically childlike theme playing in the background, and later in the same episode you have a scene of Mrs. Coulter walking down a hallway with this dread-filled music playing in the background. I feel like his score has the potential to become one of the most iconic book adaptation scores of all time. Something that I love about scores is that they can stand on their own, completely detached from the context of the film or series that they are attached to. The best example of that, in my opinion, is Avengers Endgame, a film that I hate. I do not like Avengers Endgame. It is a contrivance-riddled mess of a film which draws a terrible conclusion to the MCU storyline, in my opinion, of course. But Alan Silvestri's score is one of my favorites. I absolutely love it. He composes themes for characters that are far more memorable than themes that were composed for their own movies. In particular, Thor. Thor has had 3 movies, and each one of them has had a different theme, none of which I can remember. But in this film, Silvestri composes this almost Norwegian-sounding Thor theme, which is so much more memorable than any of the prior Thor themes. Silvestri's constant repetition of the main Avengers theme is what makes it the most iconic theme in the MCU franchise. Not just because of how memorable it is, but also because of the multitude of different settings and tones that he applies to it. One prime example that I like to think of is the scene in which Thor explains his history with the Reality Stone, and you have this almost sitcom-style version of the Avengers theme playing, and it's so memorable because of how incredibly jarring it is to hear it within that context. I also feel like Silvestri was able to pay off things that were set up in earlier Marvel movies through the music better than the actual story was able to. In earlier Marvel films, Silvestri planted little pieces of music in his composition that he was able to resurrect in Endgame and trip some sort of memory node in my brain to make me remember those original pieces, and in that way he was able to create the payoff through the score that I feel Endgame was unable to achieve through its actual story. Of course, you have the constant repetition of the main Avengers theme, but there are small pieces of music that many of you probably don't even remember that are actually paid off. Let me show you a few. I know some of you may be asking, what is this, a Lego show? How can this have a real score? I'm telling you, man. The score by Jay Vincent and Michael Kramer for Ninjago Masters of Spinjitzu is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. It was essentially able to pull off what the MCU was unable to, and that is a consistent and coherent set of themes that span over the course of the entirety of the series, and which are memorable in their own right. To be specific, I'm only talking about the first 10 seasons under the subtext Masters of Spinjitzu. I tried watching a few seasons after that point, and the music was so unspecial and unmemorable, it was a complete drop-off, but the original 10 seasons have such memorable music. The main theme, of course, Zane's theme, the Lloyd and Garmadon theme. The score for this show has no right to be as good as it is, not to mention that it's so true to the culture that it's drawing inspiration from, the Japanese and Chinese roots. It's such a great soundtrack, and even if you aren't planning on watching the show, I highly recommend you give it a listen. Before I made this video, I had a really difficult time deciding on what my favorite Hans Zimmer score was. I was down to 3: The Dark Knight trilogy, Interstellar, or Dunkirk. And in the end, I had to decide on Dunkirk, and the reason for that is because I feel this score is a perfect example of how music can amplify what you are seeing on screen. The soundtrack perfectly fits every scene and is responsible for why the film is so incredibly intense. It's not even really music in the common sense of the word, it's just ambient sound, but it's able to build such suspense for the audience. And if you were to mute Dunkirk and watch the scenes without the music, I highly doubt it would be such a nail-biting experience as it is with Zimmer's score in the background. It showcases how important music can be to telling a story, because A lot of people refer to films as having excellent visual storytelling when there's no dialogue present, but I feel that's really an example of excellent musical storytelling, because I feel the music in Dunkirk is the key reason as to why it works so well, and for that reason I feel it is the best of Hans Zimmer's work. I'm sure all of you knew that at least one of the Star Wars scores had to be on this list, but the question remains, which one? The music John Williams composed for Star Wars is of course iconic, but with some of the newer films like the sequels, for example, while having some new and original pieces of music, they are somewhat overly reliant on the audience's nostalgia for older pieces of music. For that reason, I feel Revenge of the Sith is the best Star Wars score. The reason for that is, as I just stated, because of its lack of repetition. It is the Star Wars film that has the least repetition, meaning that not a lot of films in the future bring back pieces of music from it, meaning that everything remains inside of this film that this film created. And that's why so many pieces from Revenge of the Sith are so incredibly memorable and powerful. Tracks like Anakin's Dark Deeds or Battle of the Heroes are so great because of their lack of repetition. There are a lot of prequel haters out there, and while I'm not one of them, I cannot deny that the acting in the prequels at points can be rather awkward to even bad, and those moments are when John Williams steps up and is able to convey the proper emotion that the story is unable to through music. He really does make Revenge of the Sith feel like the enormous event turning point in the Star Wars galaxy that it is. Revenge of the Sith signifies the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, and John Williams really did convey that through his score. Revenge of the Sith is just a masterpiece of a soundtrack, and it is, in my opinion, the best Star Wars score of all time. Alan Silvestri makes yet another appearance on this list with the Back to the Future soundtrack, and countless people have mentioned this as well, but Silvestri's score for the Back to the Future films really does make them feel so much more grand and epic than they are on paper. That's not to say that they are not epic or grand on paper. The casting is fantastic, as is the production. They are extremely well-made movies, but I don't feel like they'd be nearly as good as they are without Silvestri's score. Similar to the films themselves, the score is able to add in variety to things that could feel rather samey or repetitive. I talked about this in my recent Back to the Future essay, but the Back to the Future films follow the same general plot structure, but are able to add in a different setting and atmosphere in each film, and the score is able to do the same. You have the iconic Back to the Future theme, and by the time you get to the third film, you have this almost Western rendition of it, which is just extremely fun to listen to. That's just something about the score for all three of these films overall, is that it's so unabashedly fun. It's not the most emotionally moving score of all time, but it's so incredibly fun to listen to, even without the context of the films that it's within. And I don't feel like I need to explain myself any further. I mean, it's Back to the Future. Come on. Similar to Hans Zimmer, I had an extremely difficult time deciding on which of Michael Giacchino's scores was my favorite. He's one of my favorite composers, and I eventually came down to two that came out in the same year, 2009, Star Trek, the film directed by J.J. Abrams, or Up. In the end, I had to decide on Up, because while Star Trek has an incredibly exciting and exhilarating score by Giacchino, Up perfectly exemplifies the power of music and the impact that it can have on a story. Similar to Dunkirk, but not similar at all to Dunkirk, Up uses music in a way that perfectly complements the imagery you are seeing on screen. The opening of Up has constantly been referred to as a prime example of visual storytelling. And while it is that, it's also a prime example of musical storytelling, and it speaks to the power of music that the entire opening of Up is underscored by a few simple notes played on repeat, but in different keys at multiple points in time. And through that, Giacchino is able to convey such powerful emotion. And that's what music is at its core to me, is a simple expression of passion. And that's what the opening sequence and really what the entire score of Up screams to me, is passion and what music is at its core. It's simplistic, but that's what makes it powerful. That's what makes it special. And that's why Up is one of my favorite scores of all time. Not because it's one of the most epic or bombastic, but because it's so incredibly simple. While I do think the music in the entire Harry Potter series is great, none of the scores past the first 3 films quite live up to how iconic the score was that John Williams composed for the first 3 Harry Potter films. I don't have a super in-depth analysis as to why I love his score for the first 3 so much. It's just so charming and whimsical in the first 2, while taking on a darker and somewhat edgier tone in the third while still feeling consistent with what came before. And as corny and silly as this may sound, I grew up with the Harry Potter films around the same time as I grew up with my siblings, so John Williams' score for the first 3 Harry Potter films is essentially the sound of my childhood, and it's just very special to me in that way. Thomas Newman's score for 1917 perfectly encapsulates what I love about him as a composer, and that is his unpredictability. His unpredictability in this case was applied to a time period that is just as unpredictable as he is in his composition. The First World War was a time where things rarely, if ever, went according to plan, and that is perfectly represented through his abstract utilization of different instruments and notes to create an uneasy sense and build-up of dread. There is very little repetition in the score for 1917, which leads to every individual piece of music being far more memorable than it would be otherwise. The film was already masterfully directed, but Newman's score perfectly amps up the stakes of what you were seeing occur on screen. The only piece of music that is reoccurring throughout the entire film is the main theme, which appears at the beginning, is sprinkled in a few times throughout the runtime, and reappears at the end. It is perfectly integrated at the right moments, and other than that, the score remains utterly unpredictable throughout the entirety of the film. It is a crime that this film did not win Best Original Score in 2019. I know the film that did win Best Original Score in 2019 was Joker, and that score was composed by a woman, so I feel happy for her. I'm glad that someone more diverse than a 70-year-old white man won the Oscar, but at the same time, Newman's score is fantastic, and it should go down as one of the most iconic scores of all time, but even if not, it will still go down as one of my favorites. I may be cheating here, because my favorite score of all time is not a series. It's not an individual film. It's not even a trilogy. It is a 6-film epic, and that is Howard Shore's score for the Middle-earth films. You may have noticed that I said score and not scores, because I don't view each of Howard Shore's individual scores for each of the Middle-earth films to be their own contained entity. I view them all as a part of one singular epic narrative. It is simply iconic. Every single theme is so memorable, and that is because of how well his score complements the story and visuals on screen. If you were to ask me whose character's theme that is, or what group's theme that is, I would instantly be able to identify it for you, because of how well his score represents the story, to a point where his score becomes its own story. Shore's score for the Middle-earth films is one of the few soundtracks where, upon listening to it, I hear a story, because his score perfectly conveys what J.R.R. Tolkien told in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and it's simply a work of art. It's a masterpiece. What Howard Shore composed over the course of so many years is an achievement, and it is my favorite musical work of all time. I know this is not entirely surprising, considering the name of my channel and how much I love The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but I never really have fully expressed how incredibly powerful I feel the score for Middle-earth is, and it has in so many ways shaped my childhood, my life, and me pursuing some sort of career in filmmaking, animation, music. This score connects all of my passions, and that is why it is my favorite. That is it for my top 10 favorite musical scores of all time. Quite possibly my most ambitious video project to date, not necessarily because I'm ranking things, I've done that before, but because it can be extremely difficult sometimes to express why something like music connects so much with you. It's easier when it's something like a film that is tangible and you can look at, but when it's only something that you can hear, it can be very difficult to explain that. But hopefully I was able to express myself in an intelligible way in this video. You guys please let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. What are your favorite musical scores of all time? I'd love to hear your guys' favorites, and I'd love to have a discussion with you guys about our different tastes in music. That would be extremely fun. And I am planning on working on more music-related videos in the future. I'm planning on making a top 10 favorite composers, but that will probably take another week or so because this one took quite a while to put together. But as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.